Cleveland, Ohio, 1900. A sewing machine maker named Thomas H. White stood in his factory watching steam-powered vehicles chug past his windows, and he had this thought, this dangerous, expensive thought that would change American trucking forever. See, White wasn't some starry-eyed dreamer. The man built sewing machines, practical stuff, machines that worked, machines that lasted, machines that made money. But steam cars, well, they had him hooked. Problem was, steam cars in 1900 were, to put it mildly, terrible. They exploded, they leaked, they required more attention than a newborn infant, and they'd bankrupt you in maintenance before you made it across town. Most businessmen would have walked away. White walked toward it. He founded the White Sewing Machine Company's automobile division, and here's where it gets interesting. White didn't just slap together some boiler on wheels and call it innovation. No, he actually engineered the problems out. His team, led by his son, Rollin, developed a flash boiler system that generated steam almost instantly. No more waiting 20 minutes for your car to build pressure. No more nursing a fire like you're tending a locomotive. You turned a valve and you had power. The White steamer, introduced in 1901, was genuinely revolutionary. It was quiet, smooth, powerful. While gasoline cars of the era sounded like angry mechanical demons and required hand cranking that could, and frequently did, break your arm, the White steamer just glided. Wealthy buyers loved them. By 1906, White was producing more cars than nearly anyone in America. Then came 1909, and everything changed. Not because steam failed, but because gasoline got better. Charles Kettering's electric starter eliminated the hand crank problem. Gasoline engines became more reliable, more powerful, easier to fuel. And White, to his eternal credit, saw the writing on the wall. Here's what separated White from the dozens of car companies that died in this era: flexibility. While other steam car manufacturers clung to their technology like drowning men to driftwood, White pivoted completely. By 1910, the company stopped making steam cars entirely and switched to gasoline. Not a gradual transition, a full stop. Steam is dead, gasoline is the future, let's move. But White did something else, something that would define the company for the next 70 years. They looked at the market and realized passenger cars were getting crowded. Everybody and their brother was making cars. Ford was ramping up the Model T for mass production. Competition was brutal. Margins were thin. Trucks, though, commercial trucks, now that was interesting. In 1910, commercial trucking barely existed. Businesses moved goods with horses and wagons, the same way they'd done it for, a few thousand years. The trucks that did exist were mostly converted cars, underpowered, unreliable, expensive. White saw an opening. By 1912, White Motor Company, they'd dropped the sewing machine part of the name by then, was producing purpose-built trucks, not car chassis with truck beds bolted on, actual trucks designed from the ground up for commercial work, heavier frames, larger engines, reinforced suspensions. They built 1.5-ton models, 3-ton models, 5-ton models, trucks that could haul serious weight all day, every day. The genius of White's engineering showed in the details. They used unit construction methods that made repairs easier, standardized parts across model lines, modular components that could be swapped or upgraded. If a fleet operator needed more power, they could upgrade the engine without replacing the entire truck. If they needed different gearing, same thing. This wasn't common in 1912. This was genuinely forward-thinking. And the market responded. By 1915, White was one of the largest truck manufacturers in America. Bakeries bought White trucks, department stores bought White trucks, construction companies bought fleets of them. The trucks worked, they lasted, and they made economic sense. A White truck could do the work of 6 horse-drawn wagons, faster, with 1 driver instead of 6 teamsters. Then came 1917, and the United States entered World War I. And if you want to understand how White Motor Company became an American institution, you need to understand what happened next. The U.S. Army needed trucks, thousands of them, trucks that could handle European roads, which is a generous term for what were often muddy tracks. trucks that could carry ammunition, food, medical supplies, troops, trucks that could be repaired in field conditions with limited tools. White Motor Company delivered. They produced the White 1520, a 3.5-ton truck that became the workhorse of American logistics in France. Chain drive, solid rubber tires, a 4-cylinder engine that was, by modern standards, pathetically weak, but by 1917 standards, remarkably reliable. These trucks hauled supplies to the front lines through mud, snow, and shell craters. They broke down, sure, but they could be fixed. Soldiers and mechanics learned to love them because when you fixed a White truck, it stayed fixed. By the time the war ended in 1918, White Motor Company had established something invaluable, a reputation. Military contracts are nice, but the real value was proving that White trucks could handle the worst conditions imaginable and keep working. Post-war, that reputation translated directly into civilian sales. The 1920s should have been smooth sailing for White. The American economy was booming. Trucking was replacing horse-drawn freight at an accelerating pace. White had the engineering, the manufacturing capacity, the dealer network. They expanded their product line, introduced lighter models for local delivery, heavier models for long-haul freight. By 1925, White trucks were everywhere in American cities. The thing about success is it makes you confident, sometimes too confident. By the mid-1920s, White Motor Company wasn't just successful, they were dominant, one of the big three in American truck manufacturing, alongside Mack and whatever company was currently in third place because third place kept changing. White didn't change. The engineering department in Cleveland, they were genuinely excellent. While competitors were still using basically car engines and trucks, White was designing purpose-built commercial power plants. Their inline 6-cylinder engines, introduced in the mid-20s, were torque-heavy, low-revving, built for constant load. You couldn't win a race with a White engine. You could pull a loaded trailer up a mountain pass in second gear all day without overheating. That's what mattered. White also pioneered sleeper cabs for long-haul drivers. Sounds simple now, revolutionary in 1928. Before sleeper cabs, long-distance truck drivers either slept in hotels, which was expensive, or slept under their trucks, which was, sleeping under a truck. White built cabs with fold-down bunks behind the driver's seat. Suddenly, a driver could run coast-to-coast routes, sleeping in his truck between legs, cutting costs, increasing efficiency. Fleet operators loved it. Drivers, well, the bed wasn't comfortable, but it beat sleeping on the ground. 1930, the Depression hit. Truck sales collapsed. Factories closed. Competitors went bankrupt. White survived, barely, by focusing on quality over volume. They couldn't compete on price with cheaper manufacturers, so they didn't try. They built trucks for customers who needed equipment that would last 15, 20 years. Fire departments bought White fire engines because they were overbuilt and indestructible. Municipalities bought White refuse trucks for the same reason. The company stayed lean through the 30s, which meant layoffs, which meant suffering in Cleveland, but it also meant White entered World War II with intact manufacturing capacity and a solid balance sheet. And World War II, that's when White Motor Company truly became essential to American industry. The U.S. military needed trucks again, but this time on a scale that dwarfed World War I. Not thousands of trucks, hundreds of thousands of trucks. White produced scout cars, half-tracks, cargo trucks, tank retrievers, prime movers for artillery. Their 6x6 cargo truck, the White 666 model, became standard equipment for heavy hauling. It used a Hercules engine, not a White engine, because wartime production meant using whatever power plants were available, but the chassis, transmission, transfer case, that was all White engineering. These trucks went everywhere. North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Islands. They hauled ammunition through deserts, pulled stuck tanks out of mud in Normandy, carried supplies over the Burma Road, and they kept working. Mechanics in field conditions with limited parts and improvised tools kept them running. That's the ultimate test of design. Can someone fix it in the dark, in the rain, with half the proper tools and get it working again? White trucks could be fixed. By 1945, when the war ended, White had produced 150,000 military vehicles. The company was, briefly, one of the largest truck manufacturers on Earth. They had contracts, production capacity, experienced workers, government cash flow. Post-war, with American industry retooling for peacetime production and the economy booming, White should have dominated the 1950s. And for a while, they did. The White Superpower line, introduced in 1949, these were legitimately advanced trucks. They used aluminum in the cab construction to reduce weight. They offered power steering, unheard of in heavy trucks at the time, air brakes, synchronized transmissions, diesel engine options from Cummins and Detroit Diesel. White didn't make diesel engines themselves, they integrated the best available power plants from specialist manufacturers. Smart business. Let Cummins build engines, let Detroit Diesel build engines, White would build the trucks. The 1950s saw White expand into new markets. They bought Sterling Trucks, a smaller manufacturer, and absorbed their production. They bought Autocar Trucks, another truck maker with a strong regional presence. They bought Rio Motors truck division. On paper, this looked brilliant. Consolidation, economies of scale, expanded dealer networks, increased market share. On paper. In reality, White was building something increasingly complex. Multiple brands, multiple production facilities, multiple engineering departments, multiple parts systems. Sterling trucks used Sterling parts. Autocar trucks used Autocar parts. White trucks used White parts. Fleet operators who bought from multiple brands couldn't share inventory. Dealers couldn't cross-stock. Mechanics needed different training for each brand. The cost savings from consolidation kept somehow not materializing. But sales were strong through the 50s and into the early 60s. The interstate highway system was being built, which meant massive demand for heavy construction trucks and long-haul freight carriers. White's conventional cab-over-engine models, their COE designs, dominated the long-haul market. The cab-over-engine design, where the cab sits directly over the engine instead of in front of it, allowed for longer trailer lengths within legal limits, more cargo per truck, more revenue per mile. White perfected the COE design. Other manufacturers copied it. By 1963, White Motor Company had annual sales over $1 billion, one of the largest truck manufacturers on earth. And this is where the story turns. Because up until now, we've been talking about engineers and manufacturing. What comes next is about finance, ego, and spectacularly bad decisions. The leadership at White by the mid-60s was increasingly made up of financial executives, not manufacturing men. The board wanted growth, not just in trucks, but in everything. Diversification, they called it, spreading risk. The thinking was that truck sales were cyclical, tied to the economy. When the economy boomed, truck sales boomed. When the economy slumped, truck sales died. If White diversified into other industries, they'd be insulated from those cycles. Sounds reasonable, right? In practice, it meant White started buying companies that had nothing to do with trucks. They bought a farm equipment company. They bought a hydraulics manufacturer. They bought a company that made small appliances. They bought a company that made automotive parts. This wasn't vertical integration, where you buy your suppliers. This was random acquisition, buying whatever looked profitable, regardless of whether it had any synergy with the core business. 1967. White Motor Company made a move that looked, at the time, like genius. They merged with Consolidated Freightways Manufacturing Division to form Freightliner. Freightliner had been building trucks for Consolidated's own fleet since 1942, practical, efficient designs that prioritized fuel economy and driver comfort. The merger meant White suddenly had access to Freightliner's engineering and production capacity, instant market expansion. Except, White didn't really integrate Freightliner. They left it operating independently, separate management, separate engineering, separate everything, which meant White was now running essentially 5 different truck brands: White, Autocar, Diamond Rio, they'd merged Sterling and Rio into Diamond Rio, Western Star in Canada, and Freightliner, all competing with each other. Dealers were selling trucks that competed with their own brand's other trucks. It was organizational chaos. Meanwhile, competition was intensifying. PACCAR, the parent company of Peterbilt and Kenworth, was eating White's lunch in the premium heavy-duty market. Mack was holding strong with owner-operators who swore by the Mack brand loyalty that White never quite achieved. International Harvester was pushing hard in the medium-duty segment, and here came the new threat nobody saw coming: the Japanese. Okay, not in heavy trucks, not yet, but Isuzu and Hino were entering the American market in light and medium-duty trucks in the late 60s, and they were cheap, reliable, and fuel-efficient. The Arab oil embargo hadn't happened yet, but fuel economy was starting to matter. White's trucks were built like battleships, strong, durable, and thirsty. Fuel efficiency wasn't a priority. That was about to become a very expensive oversight. White's management in the late 60s made another decision that seemed smart. They started outsourcing more components: engines, transmissions, axles, even some cab components. The thinking was, why build everything in-house when specialists could build it better and cheaper? Let Cummins make engines, let Eaton make transmissions, let Rockwell make axles. White would focus on final assembly and sales. In theory, brilliant. In practice, it meant White was losing control of their product. They couldn't innovate as quickly because they were dependent on suppliers' development cycles. They couldn't differentiate their trucks because their competitors were using the same components. A White truck with a Cummins, Eaton, and Rockwell components was mechanically identical to a Freightliner or Peterbilt with the same components. The only difference was the badge on the grille and the design of the cab. That's not a strong competitive position. And then there was the labor situation. White's main production facilities were in Cleveland, heavily unionized, with wage and benefit packages that reflected decades of union negotiations. Nothing wrong with paying workers fairly, but White's labor costs were significantly higher than some competitors who'd built newer factories in right-to-work states. White was caught between their legacy workforce and their balance sheet. By 1970, White Motor Company was starting to show cracks. Sales were still strong, but profits were declining. The acquisitions weren't generating the returns the board had promised. The diversification strategy wasn't insulating the company from economic cycles. It was just spreading management attention across too many unrelated businesses. The core truck brands were underinvested and losing market share. And then came 1973 and the Arab oil embargo. Overnight, diesel fuel prices tripled, the economy slammed into recession, truck sales collapsed. White had massive inventory sitting unsold, and those trucks were fuel-inefficient dinosaurs that nobody wanted. The company's diversified divisions weren't helping, they were bleeding cash in their own right. White's leadership faced a choice. They could restructure, focus on the core truck business, divest the non-truck acquisitions they'd acquired, invest in new fuel-efficient designs, and rebuild from a position of strength. Or they could try to maintain the status quo, hope the economy recovered quickly, and assume truck sales would bounce back. They chose the latter. Big mistake. White tried to cut costs through layoffs and production slowdowns, but they didn't fundamentally change their product lineup or their business strategy. They kept operating multiple brands with minimal differentiation. They kept outsourcing components. They kept trying to maintain their diversified holdings, and their market share kept declining. By 1975, White was in serious financial trouble. They sold off some of the non-truck businesses they'd acquired, generating cash but also admitting that the diversification strategy had failed. They consolidated some production facilities, moving more production to smaller plants and closing older Cleveland operations. They laid off thousands of workers, and they started negotiating with potential buyers or partners looking for someone to inject capital. Here's where the story gets especially painful. White could have been saved. The brand still had value. The dealer network was intact. The engineering talent was still there, mostly. What White needed was investment in new product development, modernization of their truck designs for the fuel economy era, and focused management that understood the trucking industry. What they got instead was financial engineering. White's board brought in executives from the finance world who saw the company as a portfolio of assets to be managed, not a manufacturer with products that needed to be competitive. These executives looked at the balance sheet and saw real estate, factories, brand names, dealer agreements. They saw things that could be sold, leveraged, or restructured. They didn't see trucks. 1977, White sold their farm equipment division. 1978, they sold their construction equipment operations. 1979, they sold their Canadian operations. Each sale generated cash that temporarily stabilized the balance sheet, but each sale also made White a smaller, weaker company. And none of these sales addressed the fundamental problem, which was that White's truck designs were outdated and their cost structure was unsustainable. Competitors like PACCAR were investing in aerodynamic cab designs, fuel-efficient powertrains, and driver amenities that made long-haul trucking less miserable. White was cutting costs. The results were predictable. Fleet operators stopped buying White trucks.
Owner-operators, the independent truckers, who often stayed loyal to brands they trusted, started switching to Peterbilt, Kenworth, Mack. Even Freightliner, nominally part of the White family, was taking market share from White's own brands.
1980, White Motor Company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. 79 years after Thomas H. White saw steam cars rolling past his factory window and decided to build something better, the company he founded was insolvent. The bankruptcy wasn't sudden. This wasn't a case of hidden fraud or surprise collapse. This was slow-motion failure, visible to everyone as White's leadership made one bad decision after another, prioritized short-term survival over long-term competitiveness, and failed to adapt to a changing market. It was, in the truest sense, a case study on how greed, ego, and incompetent management can destroy even the most established industrial company. Let's be specific about what went wrong, because this isn't just a story about trucks. It's a story about corporate governance, about what happens when financial metrics replace manufacturing expertise at the top of an organization. White's board, through the 1970s, was increasingly dominated by finance executives and outside directors who had minimal experience in manufacturing or the trucking industry. They understood balance sheets. They understood stock prices. They did not understand why a truck driver cared about cab ergonomics or why a fleet operator would pay a premium for better fuel economy. When engineers proposed investing in new cab designs or more efficient drivetrains, the board saw expenses that would hit quarterly earnings. When competitors made those investments, White's board assumed they'd fail. The diversification strategy we talked about earlier wasn't just about buying unrelated businesses, it was about ego. White's leadership wanted to build a conglomerate, a multi-industry corporation, because that's what the successful companies of the 60s and 70s were supposedly doing. ITT, Gulf and Western, Textron, these were the models. Buy everything, diversify risk, maximize return. Except those conglomerates mostly failed too. They just failed later and less spectacularly than White. When the oil embargo hit in '73, White had an opportunity. They could have been the first major truck manufacturer to pivot aggressively towards fuel efficiency. They had the engineering talent. They had, barely, the financial resources. What they lacked was vision. Management saw the fuel crisis as temporary. Once oil prices normalized, they assumed, customers would return to buying big, powerful, thirsty trucks. They were wrong. Fuel economy became a permanent consideration. Regulations tightened. Operating costs mattered more than ever, and White was still selling fundamentally the same truck designs they'd developed in the 1960s, with minor updates. Their competitors, PACCAR especially, were designing trucks specifically for the post-embargo market. White fell behind and never caught up. Here's the most damning part. White knew they were in trouble. Internal reports from the mid-70s, these have been documented in multiple industry analyses and business school case studies, showed that White's engineering department was screaming for investment in new product development. They had proposals for aerodynamic cabs. They had partnerships with engine manufacturers for more efficient drivetrains. They had designs for lighter-weight chassis. Management rejected most of these proposals because they couldn't afford them. They couldn't afford them because they'd spent money on acquiring unrelated businesses that were now losing money. The bankruptcy in 1980 was, in a way, inevitable. White had negative cash flow, massive debt, declining sales, and no clear path to profitability. They'd sold off most of the valuable assets. The remaining truck operations were losing money on every unit sold. The company was worth dead than alive. Chapter 11 bankruptcy, for those unfamiliar, is supposed to be a tool for reorganization. The company gets protection from creditors while it restructures its operations, sheds unprofitable divisions, and emerges as a viable business. That was the theory. In White's case, bankruptcy was just a slower form of death. White continued operating under bankruptcy protection through the early 80s, but it was zombie survival. They produced trucks with outdated designs and declining quality as they cut costs. They maintained dealer relationships, but dealers were jumping ship to competitors. They kept factories running, but with skeleton crews and deferred maintenance. The White name, once synonymous with quality and reliability, became associated with a dying company. And the Whirlbergs, meanwhile, circled. Various companies looked at acquiring pieces of White. Volvo, the Swedish truck and car manufacturer, was particularly interested. They'd been trying to enter the American heavy truck market for years, and buying White would give them instant manufacturing capacity and a dealer network. But Volvo wasn't interested in all of White, just the profitable bits. 1981, Volvo bought White's truck operations. Not the company, not the name, just the truck manufacturing assets and rights to the White, Autocar, and Western Star brands. They paid relatively little because White was bankrupt and had no negotiating leverage. Volvo got factories, intellectual property, dealer relationships, and a workforce for a fraction of what these assets would have cost in a normal sale. For the workers, this was devastating. Thousands of jobs were eliminated as Volvo consolidated operations. The Cleveland factories, where White had built trucks since 1912, were mostly closed. The skilled tradesmen, the engineers, the assembly workers who'd built White trucks through 2 world wars and the golden age of American manufacturing, they were laid off or forced into early retirement. Cleveland lost a massive employer and a piece of its industrial heritage. For White Motor Company as a corporate entity, this was the end. What remained after the truck operations were sold was a shell company with some remaining assets and a lot of debt. The White Motor name persisted briefly as Volvo used it on some truck models, but by the mid-80s, even that was gone. Volvo phased out the White branding entirely, replacing it with Volvo White, then just Volvo. The other White brands met similar fates. Autocar was sold to a different buyer and continued as a small-scale specialty manufacturer. Western Star was eventually sold to Freightliner, which was by then owned by Daimler. Diamond Rio disappeared entirely. The White Sewing Machine Company, the original family business, had been sold off decades earlier and had no connection to the truck manufacturer by the time of the collapse. So what killed White Motor Company? Simple answer, greed and incompetence. More complex answer, a combination of strategic mistakes, failure to adapt, poor leadership, and the pursuit of short-term financial gains over long-term industrial strength.
You walk into a truck museum today and you'll find White trucks, beautifully restored, gleaming, sitting next to Mack's and Peterbilt's and Kenworth's as equals. Museum pieces now, relics of an American industrial empire that once dominated commercial trucking and then destroyed itself through mismanagement. The legacy of White Motor Company is complicated. On one hand, they were genuine innovators. The transition from steam to gasoline, the development of purpose-built commercial trucks, the pioneering of sleeper cabs, the military vehicles that helped win 2 world wars. These weren't minor contributions. White helped build the foundation of modern trucking. Their engineering influenced every truck manufacturer that came after them. On the other hand, White's collapse stands as a cautionary tale about corporate decision-making, about what happens when financial executives who don't understand manufacturing run manufacturing companies, about the dangers of ego-driven diversification, about the long-term consequences of prioritizing quarterly earnings over product development. Every business school should, and many do, teach the White Motor case study as an example of strategic failure. The workers paid the price. Thousands of skilled craftsmen, engineers, assembly workers, support staff lost their jobs. Families dependent on White for generations found themselves unemployed in their 50s and 60s with skills that were specific to an industry and company that no longer existed. Cleveland, once a powerhouse of American manufacturing, lost one of its anchor employers. The ripple effects, suppliers, dealers, service facilities, affected entire communities. The trucking industry moved on quickly. Volvo successfully entered the American market using White's infrastructure, then gradually replaced White's designs with their own European-influenced engineering. Paycar continued dominating the premium segment with Peterbilt and Kenworth. Mack survived its own financial troubles and remained independent, or relatively independent, they're now owned by Volvo too, until 2001. Freightliner became the market leader, eventually absorbed by Daimler. The market didn't need White, there were plenty of alternatives. But something was lost. White represented a particular approach to truck building, American style, overbuilt, durable, practical. Their trucks weren't pretty, weren't sophisticated, weren't loaded with fancy features. They were work trucks, designed by engineers who understood that a truck's job was to carry loads day after day, year after year, without drama. That philosophy still exists in American trucking, but it's diluted now.
Modern trucks are more comfortable, more efficient, more computerized. Better trucks, arguably, but the directness, the simplicity, the focus on fundamental durability over everything else, that's largely gone. There's also a broader lesson here about American manufacturing. White's collapse in 1980 wasn't unique. The same decade saw the near collapse of Chrysler, massive layoffs in steel, the beginning of the end for American consumer electronics manufacturing, the hollowing out of the textile industry. Different industries, different specific reasons, but common themes: short-term thinking, underinvestment in modernization, management that prioritized financial engineering over actual engineering, competition from foreign manufacturers who took long-term approaches. The question people always ask is, could White have been saved? And the honest answer is yes, but it would have required different decisions at multiple points in the company's history. If White had resisted the urge to diversify in the 60s, if they'd invested in fuel-efficient designs after '73, if they'd consolidated their multiple truck brands into a coherent product line, if they'd focused on core competencies instead of chasing quarterly earnings, any one of these decisions might not have been enough, but collectively they could have kept White competitive. The irony is that White's engineering was never the problem. Their trucks worked. Fleet operators who bought White equipment in the 1970s generally liked it. It lasted, it could be maintained, it did the job. The problem was that good enough stopped being good enough. When customers could buy a Freightliner or Peterbilt that was good enough and also more fuel efficient and more comfortable, why buy White? White's leadership never answered that question. They couldn't because they hadn't invested in giving customers a reason to choose White. Today, if you mention White Motor Company to anyone under 50 in America, you mostly get blank stares. The name means nothing. A couple of generations is all it took for a company that once employed tens of thousands and built hundreds of thousands of vehicles to essentially vanish from public consciousness. The trucks are still out there, some of them. Collectors restore them, truck shows feature them, old-timers tell stories about driving them. But as a living company, as an industrial force, White is gone. Volvo still builds trucks in some of the facilities that were once White's, modernized, automated, using Swedish engineering and global supply chains. There's no continuity between those operations and what White was. The DNA is gone. A few design elements persisted, some patents, some engineering solutions that were too good to abandon, but the company itself, the culture, the approach, the institutional knowledge accumulated over 80 years, that all died with it. And maybe that's the real tragedy. Not that White went bankrupt. Companies fail. That's capitalism. The tragedy is that the knowledge and culture died with it. The manufacturing expertise, the engineering depth, the understanding of how to build durable commercial equipment that could be maintained in the field and would last decades, that's harder to replace than factories or brand names. When you lose a company like White, you lose the accumulated wisdom of generations of workers and engineers. You can't get that back by buying assets. So here's what we're left with: a name that truck enthusiasts recognize, a cautionary tale for business schools, museums full of beautifully restored equipment, and the memory of what was once a genuinely important American manufacturer. White Motor Company built the trucks that built America, and then destroyed itself through greed, short-sightedness, and spectacularly bad management. If there's a final lesson, it's this: manufacturing matters, engineering matters. Understanding your product and your customers matters. Financial engineering, diversification strategies, quarterly earnings management, none of that can substitute for making good products that people want to buy. White forgot that, or rather White's leadership forgot that, and the company paid the ultimate price. The trucks they built are still out there, still working in some cases, evidence of engineering skill and manufacturing quality. Just the company that built them is gone, dismantled, absorbed, forgotten. That's the story. That's what greed and incompetence can do to even the strongest industrial empire.